Imagine hearing the words no one ever wants to hear about the person you thought would always have your back. He is no longer part of this family. For Prince Harry, those words were not whispered in a private conversation. They were blasted across the globe, carried by the press, discussed endlessly on television, and dissected in real time on social media. In a moment that would shake the foundations of the British monarchy, King Charles, the man who raised him, the man who shaped him, the man Harry called father, officially disowned his own son. The world watched as Harry, a prince who had always carried the weight of royal expectations, collapsed under the shock of the announcement. But this story is not just about a public family feud. It is about betrayal, power, loyalty, and the consequences of speaking out against centuries of tradition. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. It all began earlier that day, when a palace spokesperson stepped in front of a bank of cameras, flanked by security personnel and the understated gravitas that only royalty can command. The statement was short, precise, and brutal. Prince Harry would no longer be recognized as a member of the royal family. No title, no support, no recognition, effectively, a complete severance. For many watching, it felt like a scripted scene from a drama. But for Harry, it was a life-altering, soul-shattering moment. Can you imagine being told that the family you love, the family you trusted to protect you, had suddenly erased you from their history? What would you feel? Shock? Anger? Betrayal? Or perhaps a deep, unshakable grief that seeps into every corner of your life? The reaction was instantaneous. News outlets scrambled to cover the announcement. Headlines ran wild. Prince Harry disowned. Royal family cuts ties. Shocking split shakes monarchy. Social media erupted. Memes collided with heartfelt tributes. Conspiracy theories ran rampant, and millions debated endlessly. Why would a king make such a drastic move against his own son? Was this about public perception, personal betrayal, or something deeper, something the royal family had fought to keep secret for years? Meanwhile, inside the walls of the palace, the atmosphere was tense, suffocating almost. Advisors whispered behind closed doors. Aides exchanged nervous glances, and Harry sat in stunned disbelief, unable to comprehend the finality of what had just occurred. For a man who had been taught duty, loyalty, and service, this was more than a personal crisis. It was a fundamental rupture of identity. Harry had spent decades navigating the complicated web of royal expectations, public scrutiny, and personal desires. And now, in an instant, all of it had been stripped away. But let's rewind for a moment. To understand why this announcement is so earth-shattering, we have to go deeper into the history of tension, whispered arguments, and private conflicts that few people knew existed. Harry had long been the subject of public fascination, but he was also a man wrestling with personal demons, family pressure, and the suffocating spotlight of a media machine that never slept. He married Meghan Markle, a woman from outside the royal sphere, and together they navigated a storm of scrutiny, expectation, and, ultimately, conflict with the institution itself. Their departures from official duties had already signaled cracks in the monarchy. Yet no one, not even the most seasoned royal observers, predicted that the cracks would widen into a chasm so vast that a son would be formally disowned by his father. You might be asking yourself, what led to this moment? What secret conflicts, private grievances, and unspoken truths drove a father to sever his ties with his son? What could push a man of immense power and public responsibility to make a decision that would shock the world? The answers are as complex as they are dramatic, weaving together decades of royal protocol, personal missteps, emotional betrayals, and calculated maneuvers behind closed doors. And just when you think you understand, the story twists further, revealing layers that few could anticipate. Consider this. In the hours following the announcement, reports surfaced that Harry had sought refuge in a private wing of a palace residence, far away from the cameras and the clamor. He was said to be pacing the halls, repeatedly calling friends and confidants, trying to process a reality that no one had prepared him for. According to insiders, he was in visible distress, trembling, pale, struggling to hold back tears, and at one point, collapsing into a chair as the weight of the news hit him. Witnesses say that he barely spoke for several minutes, his mind racing with questions that had no immediate answers. How do you recover from being erased from the very lineage you were born into? How do you face the world after being told you no longer belong to your family? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the reality that Harry faced, and the answers, as it turns out, are far from simple. Meanwhile, the public reaction was a storm unto itself. Media coverage oscillated between shock, speculation, and rampant conjecture. Social media debates were relentless. Some condemned the palace's decision as cruel and unnecessary, while others argued it was a long overdue act of accountability. Memes and hashtags began circulating within hours, spreading the story far beyond the confines of the United Kingdom. The global fascination with royalty had never been more evident, as millions tuned in, shared their opinions, and waited for the next development. In a way, the world had become both witness and participant in a family tragedy unfolding on a historic stage. But even as the media frenzy roared, a quieter, more insidious drama was playing out within the palace walls. Advisors and senior officials debated how to manage the fallout. Legal teams reviewed documents, personal correspondences, and private communications. Security personnel were on high alert. Meanwhile, Harry's own legal and personal advisors tried to guide him through a storm that was as much about perception as it was about reality. Every decision, every movement, every word spoken had consequences that rippled outward, touching lives far beyond the palace gates. At the center of it all was Harry himself, a man torn between love for his family and a sense of personal betrayal. Imagine being caught between duty and conscience, between public image and private pain, and between loyalty and survival. Harry's collapse was not just a physical reaction. It was a manifestation of emotional overload, grief, anger, fear, and disbelief all colliding at once. Those closest to him described the scene as one of profound vulnerability, a moment rarely witnessed in public life, where a figure long seen as confident and composed was suddenly exposed in his most human form. As viewers, it's important to ask ourselves, why does this story resonate so powerfully? Perhaps it is the universality of family conflict magnified onto a global stage. Perhaps it is the intrigue of power, betrayal, and hidden motives within one of the world's most scrutinized institutions. Or perhaps it is the raw emotion of a man grappling with a reality he could neither anticipate nor control. Whatever the reason, the story of Harry's disownment is one that commands attention, empathy, and curiosity. And yet, this introduction only scratches the surface. Beneath the headlines and social media chatter lies a labyrinth of secrets, private confrontations, and explosive revelations that the palace and the royal family have fought to keep hidden. From secret meetings to leaked documents, from private confrontations to whispered threats, the story grows darker, more complex, and far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. And it is in these hidden corners that the true drama of Harry's disownment comes to light, a story of power, betrayal, and survival that will redefine how we view the royal family and the man at its center. Have you ever witnessed a world-shattering announcement live and wondered what happens the instant reality breaks someone's life apart? That was the moment the palace statement hit the news wires. A simple declaration, but its impact was anything but simple. Prince Harry, a man who had weathered scrutiny, controversy, and personal battles for decades, was suddenly facing an official erasure from the very institution he had been born into. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't speculation. It was formal, final, and absolute. The morning had begun like any other, with the royal household functioning under the usual rigid structure, briefings, appointments, and carefully orchestrated schedules. But behind closed doors, tension simmered. Advisors whispered. Security personnel exchanged urgent glances. Somewhere, deep within the palace corridors, a decision had been made. And then, at precisely the appointed hour, the announcement was delivered. It was short, direct, and devastating. Prince Harry would no longer be recognized as part of the royal family. Imagine reading that on a screen, hearing it on the radio, or watching it on television. Now imagine being the person it's about. Harry was somewhere within the private quarters of the palace, surrounded by aides and advisors, yet utterly alone in the moment of shock. Witnesses report that the room fell into an almost surreal silence. Phones were clutched, papers were shuffled nervously, and then Harry, The prince, who had always seemed unflappable in public, slumped forward, gripping the arms of his chair as though holding himself together physically might somehow keep the world intact. It's easy for outsiders to look at this moment and think of it as simply a news event, another royal scandal. But consider the weight behind the words. No recognition, no title, no support. For Harry, this was the erasure of his identity as a son, a husband, and a member of the monarchy. The public could see the headlines, but they couldn't see the inner tremors shaking his core. Can you imagine feeling so abruptly severed from your own history? The betrayal of blood, tradition, and loyalty isn't something you recover from in days, not even in months. Yet the announcement did more than just affect Harry. Its ripples spread instantly across the global media landscape. Television anchors struggled to maintain composure as they read the statement live. Social media platforms exploded. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Each was a battlefield of speculation, outrage, sympathy, and disbelief. News agencies raced to provide context. Commentators debated the motives behind the king's decision. And somewhere in that chaos, a man was trying to process what it meant for him personally, emotionally, and practically. While the media spun into a frenzy, inside the palace, the dynamics were even more intense. Staffers who had witnessed countless royal crises could not recall an event of such emotional gravity. Harry's aides described a man in disbelief, muttering, pacing, and alternating between moments of silence and bursts of questioning. Why? He asked repeatedly. Why would this happen now? Why like this? The room felt claustrophobic. Air seemed to thicken with tension. It was a private storm in a public world, a collision of human vulnerability with institutional power. And yet, even in that silence, there were layers of drama that the world wouldn't see for hours. Secret meetings, hurried calls to lawyers, whispered conversations with advisors, all under the looming presence of security personnel, ensuring that nothing leaked before the official announcement reached the press. Every glance, every word, every hesitation carried significance. For Harry, even a single misstep could result in further personal, legal, or public fallout. But what had led to this moment? The surface answer is simple. Tensions between Harry and the monarchy had been escalating for years. But the deeper story is far more tangled, a web of small betrayals, miscommunications, and unresolved grievances. From the moment he first stepped into royal life, Harry had been navigating expectations that often felt contradictory. Duty versus personal happiness, tradition versus individuality, loyalty versus honesty. Each decision he made, from public appearances to private statements, was scrutinized to the point of exhaustion. And yet, nothing could have prepared him for this official disownment. According to insiders, there were hints of trouble in the days leading up to the announcement. Private meetings, sometimes heated, sometimes whispered, had taken place in corridors, offices, and hidden chambers within the palace. Advisors debated endlessly, weighing the personal consequences against the public image. Some argued for reconciliation, others for decisive action. Ultimately, the king's decision reflected a calculated choice, one that would send shockwaves far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. Meanwhile, Harry's personal response was visceral. Sources say he remained in isolation for hours, periodically speaking in low, urgent tones to Meghan, trusted friends, and advisors. His collapse was not merely physical. It was a public manifestation of years of pressure, emotional fatigue, and a profound sense of betrayal. Observers described him as trembling, pale, almost unable to breathe, as though the weight of centuries of tradition and expectation had physically pressed down on him. What do you do when the institution you were born into suddenly turns its back on you? What becomes of your identity when every title, every privilege, every security net is pulled away in a single sweeping declaration? As the world debated, the palace prepared for the inevitable questions. Spokespersons drafted statements, PR teams rehearsed narratives, and advisors briefed the media on talking points. Everything was being managed carefully, but the human element, Harry's immediate emotional reality, could not be controlled. And as he tried to reconcile with the enormity of the moment, he realized that nothing in his public or private life had prepared him for the permanence of this decision. And then there were the unintended consequences. Family members, distant relatives, even foreign royalty began weighing in, sometimes publicly, sometimes through unofficial channels. Some offered support, others remained silent, and some subtly reinforced the king's decision. Friends and confidants outside the palace were left scrambling to provide guidance and reassurance. Meanwhile, legal teams began reviewing implications for inheritance, titles, and security arrangements. The fallout was immediate, widespread, and far from over. Consider the psychological toll. Harry had long been in the public eye, balancing fame, scrutiny, and personal grief. But this moment was different. This was not an interview, a public appearance, or even a contentious media story. This was the erasure of his identity at its most fundamental level. And the emotions were raw: grief, anger, disbelief, helplessness, and a deep, penetrating sense of loss. Imagine standing at the center of a storm, the world watching every move, while your own father's words reverberate as an undeniable finality. You are no longer family. And just when it seemed the storm couldn't grow more intense, new reports surfaced. Sources suggested that the decision had not been sudden. There were months, if not years, of secret planning, heated discussions, and private confrontations leading up to this moment. Some insiders claimed that specific statements Harry had made in interviews and public appearances were cited as justification. Others hinted at private grievances, unresolved disputes, and long-standing tensions that had festered beneath the polished surface of royal life. But the details were murky, intentionally obscured, leaving the world to speculate while Harry bore the emotional brunt. And yet, as this chapter of the story unfolds, there is still more beneath the surface. There are private documents, undisclosed conversations, and hidden meetings that few will ever see. There are tensions between advisors, conflicting motives within the palace staff, and whispers of interventions that never materialized. Every moment, every interaction, every unspoken word contributed to a perfect storm, one that would leave a prince physically and emotionally reeling. But what came next inside those palace walls would escalate the crisis in ways no one could have anticipated. Just when Harry thought he had reached the lowest point, events unfolded that would redefine the narrative entirely, and the world would soon witness the next shocking twist in this historic royal drama. Have you ever wondered how a relationship that seems unbreakable can quietly erode, almost invisibly, until one day the fracture becomes a chasm? That's exactly what happened between Prince Harry and the royal family. To truly understand the shock waves of the disownment, we need to trace the history of tension, the moments of friction, the whispers behind closed doors, and the decisions that, piece by piece, built a foundation for this public rupture. This is not a story of a single event. It is a story of decades of miscommunication, misunderstanding, and emotional strain that finally reached its breaking point. From the beginning, Harry's life was defined by extraordinary circumstance. Born into the royal family, he was raised in the public eye, with cameras, reporters, and the relentless scrutiny of both domestic and international media. He had the privileges of royalty, yes, the titles, the access, the security. But he also inherited the pressures of tradition, duty, and unyielding expectations. For a child, even a prince, that is a heavy weight. And Harry was not just any child. He was the second son, a role often overlooked in the line of succession but magnified in the court of public opinion. Every action, every misstep, every word he spoke was recorded, analyzed, and criticized. As a teenager, Harry displayed the classic signs of a young man trying to assert his individuality while trapped in a gilded cage. Rebellious acts, youthful indiscretions, and occasional defiance against protocol were documented in the tabloids. It was during these years that the first subtle fractures in his relationship with the royal establishment began to appear. Publicly, his behavior was labeled as reckless or immature. Privately, it was seen as the struggles of a boy navigating trauma, grief, and expectation simultaneously. His mother's tragic death at such a young age added an emotional complexity that few could understand. Yet it was impossible to separate Harry's grief from his actions and the royal perception of him. Then came the years of military service. Harry's time in the armed forces was both a proving ground and a coping mechanism. He sought to forge an identity separate from the palace, to prove his courage and discipline in a world that respected action and service rather than lineage and ceremony. And yet, even in the uniform, Harry could not escape the glare of the public or the judgment of the palace. Reports indicate that during these years, he felt both pride and frustration. Pride in his service, but frustration at the constant reminder that his role in the royal family remained defined not by his accomplishments, but by his birthright. The tensions became more pronounced when Harry began stepping into his adult role within the monarchy. Public appearances, patronages, and charity work were part of the expected duties. He executed them with energy and charisma, yet every initiative was scrutinized. Advisors within the palace often debated whether Harry's choices, his approach to charity, his willingness to engage directly with sensitive topics, were appropriate. And sometimes, these debates leaked, creating an undercurrent of unease that only Harry seemed to feel. Imagine being constantly measured, not for what you do, but for whether you conform to invisible, ever-changing standards. Then came Meghan Markle. Her arrival into Harry's life was transformative, but also a flashpoint for conflict. She was not just a partner. She was a symbol of change, of modernity, diversity, and independence. From the palace's perspective, Meghan represented both opportunity and threat. Her influence on Harry was undeniable, and it became clear that his priorities and perspectives were shifting. Sources suggest that palace officials worried about Harry's increasing willingness to challenge traditional expectations and speak publicly about personal and controversial matters. They perceived it as a subtle rebellion, a challenge to centuries of carefully maintained protocol. As Harry and Meghan's relationship deepened, tensions escalated. Interviews, public statements, and charitable initiatives increasingly reflected their desire to carve a life outside traditional constraints. But every action they took was dissected. Every word in the press was scrutinized. And as the media narrative intensified, so too did the internal family pressure. According to insiders, heated private conversations began to occur, not merely discussions about appearances or protocol, but confrontations over loyalty, discretion, and the line between public responsibility and personal freedom. These conversations often ended unresolved, leaving emotional residue that would accumulate over time. Even before their public exit from royal duties, there were warning signs. Friends of Harry report that he expressed growing frustration with what he perceived as double standards, favoritism, and selective scrutiny within the royal family. He believed that some relatives were allowed freedoms that were denied to him. He felt that his loyalty and service were undervalued, while his mistakes were magnified. And Meghan, acutely aware of the media's treatment of her, became a staunch ally, amplifying Harry's dissatisfaction, but also providing him with emotional support that the family structure seemed increasingly unable to offer. The public perception of these tensions often focused on the narrative of a royal rift, but insiders describe a far more intricate dynamic. There were moments of attempted reconciliation, private conversations, mediated meetings, and ceremonial gatherings that, on the surface, appeared cordial. But behind these interactions lay unspoken resentments. Harry reportedly felt misunderstood and underappreciated. The family, in turn, often viewed his actions as impulsive, emotional, or self-serving. Each interaction, whether a smile at a public event or a carefully worded statement, carried layers of subtext, interpreting intent and meaning in ways that could either escalate or defuse tension. One particularly pivotal period came during interviews and media engagements, where Harry spoke openly about mental health, personal struggles, and criticism of the monarchy. Some viewed these disclosures as courageous, others as betrayal. According to multiple sources, palace advisors were alarmed by the level of personal vulnerability Harry revealed publicly. They feared it undermined the institution, exposed internal disputes, and painted the family in a negative light. From Harry's perspective, however, speaking out was not rebellion. It was a survival mechanism, a way to reconcile personal pain with public expectation. This contradiction, duty versus authenticity, became a central tension that would define his trajectory. Then there were the smaller, quieter incidents, often overlooked by the media, but emotionally significant. Private disagreements over schedules, miscommunications during family events, perceived slights, and disagreements over how certain charitable initiatives were conducted, all contributed to the perception that Harry was increasingly alienated. And while some of these incidents may seem trivial on their own, when accumulated over years, they formed a narrative of estrangement, one that both Harry and the palace carried with heavy emotional weight. It's crucial to understand that these tensions were not simply about personal preference or stubbornness. They were about identity, loyalty, and expectation. Harry was navigating an institution that demanded perfection, compliance, and adherence to tradition, while also trying to maintain personal autonomy, emotional honesty, and a sense of moral agency. The clash of these forces created a pressure cooker environment, where every choice had amplified consequences and every misstep felt monumental. By the time Meghan entered the picture, Harry was already primed for conflict. Her presence and influence accelerated the tensions, bringing private disagreements into sharper relief and making public perception an unavoidable factor. The couple's decision to step back from official duties was not impulsive. It was the culmination of years of frustration, alienation, and perceived injustice. And yet, even this drastic move did not resolve the tensions. In fact, it intensified them, drawing the family into unprecedented territory and laying the groundwork for the moment when the king would ultimately take the drastic step of disowning his own son. Throughout all of this, there were small, almost invisible threads connecting past grievances to the present. Childhood experiences, parental loss, public scrutiny, internal family politics. All these factors intertwined to create a scenario where a personal rupture could easily become a historic event. And while the world watched the announcement unfold as a sudden, shocking act, those who had been observing Harry's life closely knew that the seeds of this moment had been planted decades ago, nurtured by a complex blend of personal pain, institutional pressure, and public expectation. So when the official disownment finally occurred, it was the culmination of years of tension, accumulated grievances, and unspoken conflicts. It was a moment that, while sudden in appearance, was decades in the making. And for Harry, the emotional impact was magnified precisely because it touched every aspect of his identity, his role as a son, a prince, a husband, and a man trying to navigate the impossible demands of a world that never stopped watching. And yet, even with all this history laid bare, the most shocking revelations were still to come. Because behind the public narrative of tension and estrangement, there existed private conversations, undisclosed grievances, and explosive secrets that the palace had desperately tried to keep hidden, secrets that, when revealed, would make the disownment not just a personal tragedy, but a story of betrayal, manipulation, and power that would leave the world stunned. But what happened in those secret conversations, and how they directly led to the king's decision, is a story that no one expected, and it would turn everything the public thought they knew about Harry's relationship with the royal family upside down. Have you ever wondered what happens behind the polished doors of power when the cameras are off, the press is silenced, and the world believes everything is serene? The truth is far more volatile. The palace is not just a home. It is a fortress of secrets, a theater of negotiation, and a battlefield of influence. And in the days leading up to Prince Harry's disownment, those corridors and private chambers became the stage for a series of secret meetings that would ultimately seal his fate. The first of these meetings took place in a room few outside the inner circle ever enter. It was a space of understated elegance. Tall windows filtered light across ornate rugs, portraits of long-dead monarchs stared down from gilded frames, and the air carried a mix of anticipation and tension that was almost palpable. In this room, advisors, senior family members, and legal counsel gathered to discuss Harry, not the boy they had watched grow up, nor the public figure who delighted millions, but the problem that had quietly grown into a crisis no one could ignore. What was said behind those closed doors? Only fragments have leaked to the public, but even these fragments hint at explosive tension. Advisors reportedly debated Harry's behavior, his public statements, his relationship with Meghan, and the implications for the monarchy. One aide, speaking anonymously, described the atmosphere as electric with fear and judgment, like walking on the edge of a blade. Every word carried consequences. Every gesture was read as a signal of loyalty or dissent. The meetings were not just analytical. They were intensely emotional. Sources describe raised voices, heated arguments, and moments of near physical confrontation. Some senior officials argued passionately for patience and reconciliation, warning that a drastic move would shatter public perception and alienate millions of supporters. Others advocated decisiveness, claiming that the family's image and legacy demanded a firm, unambiguous action, even if it meant disowning a son. And then there was King Charles himself, presiding over the room with a measured demeanor that concealed inner turmoil. Reports indicate that he was both resolute and conflicted, balancing personal feelings of fatherly attachment with institutional obligations to protect the monarchy. According to insiders, at one point, he paused mid-discussion, staring at Harry's portrait on the wall, and reportedly whispered to an aide, "I never wanted it to come to this." But the words, private and almost inaudible, were drowned out by the cacophony of the debate around him. What made these meetings explosive was not simply the clash of opinions, but the stakes involved. This was more than a disagreement over etiquette or public messaging. It was a confrontation over legacy, power, and control. Every advisor understood that a decision here would resonate for decades, shaping not just Harry's future, but the very narrative of the monarchy itself. And in these rooms, the tension was thick enough to choke anyone who entered. One particular meeting, described by multiple sources as the turning point, is worth examining. It took place in the dead of night, a time when few staff members were present and confidentiality could be maintained. Harry's actions, including interviews and private communications, were dissected line by line. Advisors debated whether his words constituted a breach of loyalty or an understandable expression of grief and frustration. Some argued that Harry was being unfairly judged, while others insisted that precedent and protocol demanded firm action. By the end of the night, a consensus had emerged, one that would ultimately lead to the king's unprecedented decision. Yet, even with consensus, the human element remained volatile. Behind closed doors, emotions ran raw. Some attendees reportedly wept, recalling Harry as a child, remembering his mother, and struggling to reconcile personal attachment with duty. Others expressed anger, frustration, and even fear, convinced that Harry's actions threatened the stability of centuries of tradition. The mix of sentiment created a highly combustible environment, where a single comment could ignite an argument and shift the course of decisions permanently. And there were interventions that almost changed everything. According to insiders, several senior family members attempted to mediate, proposing compromises that would preserve Harry's dignity while maintaining the monarchy's image. But these proposals were rejected, sometimes abruptly, sometimes with cold calculation. The reasoning? That any perceived leniency could be interpreted as weakness, setting a dangerous precedent for the institution and opening the door for further public disputes. Meanwhile, the logistical orchestration of these meetings was a drama in itself. Security measures were tightened, private passages were used to shuttle advisors discreetly, and sensitive documents were circulated under strict supervision. Even the scheduling was designed to minimize leaks and prevent the media from discovering the extent of internal deliberations. It was a chess game, with advisors and family members moving strategically, weighing risks, predicting reactions, and anticipating the next moves. And at the center of it all was the question of Harry, a man increasingly seen as unpredictable, emotional, and a potential threat to the delicate balance of power. What makes these secret meetings all the more intriguing is the reported presence of legal counsel. Lawyers were not just there to advise on formalities. They were there to assess every possible consequence, from title stripping to inheritance implications, from public statements to potential litigation. Every word spoken could have legal ramifications, and every argument carried the weight of centuries-old tradition. Sources suggest that some lawyers even advised delaying any action, warning that a hasty decision could result in irreversible damage to the monarchy's reputation. But in the end, their caution was overruled by the urgency perceived by the king and his closest advisors. And while the meetings were happening behind closed doors, another layer of intrigue unfolded outside them. Insiders leaked fragments of conversations to select journalists, planting seeds of speculation in the public sphere. Every leak was calculated, designed to gauge public reaction and pressure key decision-makers. It was a strategic play, a psychological maneuver, a reminder that even when doors are closed, nothing in the modern age stays secret for long. The secrecy surrounding these meetings also amplified the emotional impact on Harry. He was reportedly aware of discussions taking place without him, feeling increasingly isolated and betrayed. Imagine being in his position, knowing that private conversations about your fate are happening just beyond the door, where every comment and judgment could seal your destiny, and yet you are powerless to influence them. The psychological strain, combined with grief and frustration, created a state of emotional overload, one that would culminate in the very public collapse we saw following the announcement. And yet, even in the most charged moments, some advisors reportedly attempted to interject a humanizing perspective. They reminded the king of Harry's charitable work, his military service, his personal struggles, and the loyalty he had shown despite challenges. They argued that empathy and reconciliation could prevent a historic rupture. But their voices, however passionate, were ultimately outweighed by those insisting on firm action, concerned primarily with preservation of the monarchy's image and authority. The culmination of these secret meetings, with debates raging through the night, ultimately led to a pivotal decision. The king would disown his son. But it wasn't a simple decision. It was a carefully orchestrated act, calculated to assert authority, protect the institution, and control the narrative. Every advisor, every document, every whispered conversation contributed to the timing, wording, and delivery of the announcement. It was as if decades of tension, resentment, and fear had condensed into a single, irrevocable moment, one that would leave Harry grappling with the sudden severance from the family he had known his entire life. And what happened next, after the meetings concluded and the plan was set into motion, escalated the emotional and public drama even further. Harry, unaware of the precise timing, received the news like a thunderbolt, and his reaction would shock the world, revealing not just the depth of his personal pain, but the extraordinary human stakes behind decisions that, for most observers, seemed purely institutional. But the most explosive revelation from these secret meetings, the conversation that changed everything, was yet to be revealed, hidden in documents and whispered accounts that would emerge only after the world had absorbed the shock of the announcement. And when it came to light, it would make Harry's disownment not just a personal tragedy, but a historic scandal. Have you ever wondered how one person can alter the course of history within an institution that has stood for centuries? For Prince Harry, that person was Meghan Markle. Her entrance into Harry's life was transformative in ways that were deeply personal and profoundly political. She was more than a partner. She was a catalyst, someone who challenged traditions, questioned protocols, and demanded that Harry confront the impossible choice between loyalty to family and loyalty to himself. But what few outside the palace realized was how central Meghan had become in the events that ultimately led to Harry's disownment. From the very beginning, Meghan was a polarizing figure. As an American actress, she came from outside the royal ecosystem, bringing with her a combination of charisma, confidence, and independence that both inspired and unsettled the family. Royal insiders reportedly described initial interactions as polite, but tinged with skepticism. Was she capable of understanding the immense pressures of royal life? Could she navigate centuries of unspoken rules? And, perhaps most importantly, would she influence Harry in ways that challenged the very foundation of the monarchy? It quickly became clear that Meghan was not a traditional royal consort. She spoke openly, advocated passionately, and demanded agency over her public image and personal choices. For Harry, this was liberating. For the royal establishment, it was unsettling. Sources suggest that Meghan's presence emboldened Harry, encouraging him to voice frustrations that had long been suppressed. Interviews, public statements, and media appearances began to reflect not just Harry's perspective, but a shared vision shaped by Meghan, one that emphasized personal freedom, mental health advocacy, and challenging rigid protocols. The tension between Meghan and the palace escalated quietly at first. Private advisors reportedly flagged her influence as a risk to institutional stability, noting that Harry increasingly relied on her counsel over that of traditional advisors. There were discussions about appearances, charitable initiatives, and even private communications, all scrutinized for how they might reflect on the monarchy. Some insiders worried that Meghan's approach, while modern and progressive, was eroding the carefully maintained hierarchy and authority within the family. Then came the public moments that amplified scrutiny. From red carpet events to high-profile interviews, Meghan's assertiveness was on display. Her decisions were bold, her demeanor confident, and her voice unafraid to confront controversial topics. This visibility, while celebrated by some, was perceived by palace officials as a challenge to their control. Reports indicate that certain advisors felt Meghan was shaping Harry's decisions, guiding him into conflicts, and undermining traditional channels of communication. Whether fair or not, the perception alone was enough to ignite internal alarm. One insider revealed that in the months leading up to Harry's disownment, there were numerous private meetings in which Meghan was discussed extensively, often more than Harry himself. Advisors debated whether her influence was protective, manipulative, or simply a natural consequence of her partnership with Harry. Some argued that Meghan had acted as a stabilizing force, helping Harry navigate personal struggles, while others suggested that her presence had intensified existing conflicts, making reconciliation increasingly difficult. Harry's loyalty to Meghan was unwavering, even as tensions with the family deepened. Friends and confidants report that he often defended her, insisting that her intentions were pure and that her perspective provided clarity he could not achieve alone. And yet, the royal family's perception was different. They saw a partnership that challenged hierarchy, questioned authority, and refused to conform. Every public appearance together, every interview, every charitable initiative was interpreted through the lens of influence and power dynamics, rather than personal choice. The impact of Meghan's role became even more pronounced after their decision to step back from royal duties. The couple's exit was framed as a desire for independence and privacy, but palace insiders saw it as a rupture, a deliberate distancing that undermined the family's cohesion and public narrative. According to leaked reports, Meghan's counsel was instrumental in shaping the strategy for their departure, influencing everything from timing to public messaging. The family, already wary of her influence, viewed this as a pivotal act of defiance, one that could not be ignored. And yet, the story is far more complex than simple blame. Meghan herself faced enormous pressure, criticism, and isolation. The media relentlessly scrutinized her every move, often misrepresenting intentions, exaggerating conflicts, and perpetuating narratives of discord. According to confidants, this pressure created a feedback loop. The more she was attacked publicly, the more Harry defended her, the more the family perceived challenge, and the deeper the rift became. In many ways, Meghan was both the catalyst and the mirror, reflecting back the tensions, contradictions, and vulnerabilities within the family that had long been ignored. But the most dramatic moments occurred behind closed doors. Multiple sources describe private confrontations between Meghan, Harry, and senior family members where issues of loyalty, protocol, and personal boundaries were debated heatedly. Meghan reportedly spoke candidly, challenging assumptions, asserting agency, and refusing to accept decisions she felt were unjust. These interactions, while rarely seen by the public, were pivotal in shaping Harry's mindset and, ultimately, the decisions that led to his disownment. Her presence amplified emotional stakes, forcing the family to confront uncomfortable truths while simultaneously escalating conflict. Interestingly, Meghan's role was not limited to advocacy for Harry. She also reportedly acted as a gatekeeper, controlling the flow of information, guiding public statements, and influencing private conversations. Some advisors felt this was overreach, while others acknowledged that her strategic input was sophisticated and effective. Regardless, her influence became an undeniable factor in the palace's deliberations. Her assertiveness, intelligence, and ability to navigate media scrutiny created a dynamic in which Harry's decisions were increasingly aligned with her counsel, and increasingly at odds with the expectations of the monarchy. Public perception further complicated matters. While Harry and Meghan's supporters celebrated their partnership as a modern love story, critics portrayed Meghan as manipulative or ambitious. Every action was analyzed, every statement dissected, and every interaction judged. These perceptions fed into internal palace calculations, intensifying the urgency of decision-making. Advisors argued that the monarchy's image depended on asserting control and reinforcing boundaries, while Harry's allegiance to Meghan made compromise increasingly unlikely. And yet, even as Meghan's role intensified tension, she was also a source of resilience for Harry. Friends described moments where she calmed him, offered perspective, and reinforced his sense of self-worth when the weight of scrutiny threatened to overwhelm him. Her influence was both protective and transformative. She encouraged Harry to confront difficult truths, speak out, and prioritize emotional authenticity, even when the cost was enormous. But in doing so, she inadvertently made him more vulnerable to institutional retaliation. As the days leading to the dissolution unfolded, insiders reveal that Meghan's involvement became a focal point in the palace's strategic discussions. Advisors debated not just Harry's actions, but how Meghan's influence might be curtailed or mitigated. The conversations were fraught with emotion, as they balanced the desire to preserve family relationships with the perceived necessity of maintaining authority. Some advisors even suggested private interventions, attempts at mediation, and reconciliatory gestures, but these were ultimately overshadowed by the urgency to act decisively. And then came the final escalation. According to multiple sources, a series of private confrontations and leaked communications created an environment in which the king felt he had no choice but to act. Harry's loyalty to Meghan, combined with his increasingly public criticisms, was interpreted as a direct challenge to the family's authority. The decision to disown him was not made lightly. It was the culmination of years of tension, amplified by Meghan's presence, influence, and insistence on authenticity. But what happened next, as Harry processed the reality of disownment while Meghan stood by his side, is a story few could have predicted. The emotional fallout, the private confrontations, and the public spectacle that followed would push the boundaries of royal protocol, test the limits of personal resilience, and reveal just how high the stakes had become. And the most shocking truth about Meghan's role, the revelation that would reshape the narrative entirely, had yet to emerge, hidden in private messages, confidential interviews, and confidential accounts that would surface only after the world had absorbed the immediate shock of the disownment. Have you ever seen a moment so shocking that it stops time? That is exactly what happened when Prince Harry collapsed after receiving the official notice of disownment. The palace announcement was not merely a statement. It was a seismic rupture that shook him to his core. A man known for resilience, courage, and composure suddenly confronted the full weight of rejection from the institution he had dedicated his life to, and the response was immediate, visceral, and unforgettable. Witnesses described the scene in stark detail. Harry, moments earlier engaged in routine discussions with his aides, suddenly froze, his expression turning pale. His hands gripped the arms of the chair as though he were trying to physically hold himself together. And then, with a slow, almost imperceptible slump, he collapsed. The room went silent. Advisors rushed forward, attempting to stabilize him. Security personnel, trained for emergencies of every kind, exchanged anxious glances. No one expected the emotional devastation to manifest so physically, and yet it was undeniable. This collapse was not simply a physical reaction. It was the culmination of years of pressure, emotional strain, and personal loss. Childhood grief, public scrutiny, constant criticism, and recent tensions had layered upon each other until a single announcement could no longer be absorbed. Harry's aides reported that he was trembling, struggling to breathe, and muttering fragments of disbelief. Why? How? This can't be real. Each word was a fragment of the internal storm raging within him, a storm that had been decades in the making. While Harry was recovering, the palace faced an unprecedented communications crisis. The media had already picked up the announcement, and social media erupted almost instantaneously. Tweets, live streams, and news broadcasts shared the story globally within minutes. The palace's public relations teams scrambled to manage messaging, ensuring that the announcement was framed as formal, necessary, and in the interest of institutional integrity. But no carefully crafted statement could contain the human drama unfolding behind closed doors. Outside the palace, reactions were immediate and intense. Public opinion split sharply. Some sympathized with Harry, viewing the disownment as a cruel and disproportionate act by the monarchy. Others interpreted the decision as a necessary assertion of authority, a move to protect centuries of tradition and hierarchy. Commentators debated endlessly about the role Meghan played, the potential long-term impact on the monarchy, and what this meant for the royal family's global image. And amid all this discussion, one truth remained clear. Harry's collapse had humanized an event that many initially perceived as purely institutional. Inside the palace, the fallout was multifaceted. Harry's close friends and advisors rallied to support him, providing both emotional and logistical assistance. They helped him process the enormity of the moment, advised him on next steps, and worked to shield him from further public exposure until he could regain composure. Legal advisors, meanwhile, began reviewing implications for titles, inheritance, and security arrangements. Every contingency was analyzed, and every decision carried profound emotional and strategic weight. But the emotional intensity was only part of the story. The collapse also sparked a series of urgent internal communications. King Charles, reportedly distressed by the physical manifestation of Harry's emotional turmoil, convened emergency meetings with senior advisors. Discussions centered on whether the family should reach out directly, how the narrative should be managed in the media, and whether additional private interventions were necessary. This delicate balancing act highlighted the tension between personal care and institutional duty, and it underscored the unprecedented nature of the situation. Harry's physical reaction was mirrored by a psychological one. Observers note that he oscillated between shock, disbelief, anger, and profound sadness. Moments of tears were followed by intense introspection and bursts of frustration. Friends report that he repeatedly questioned the fairness of the decision, reflected on past events, and contemplated the implications for his children, his family, and his public life. The collapse, therefore, was not a singular event. It was a cascade, a visceral reaction that triggered a complex web of emotional processing. Meanwhile, Meghan Markle's role during the immediate aftermath was pivotal. She reportedly remained at Harry's side, offering comfort, perspective, and reassurance. Friends describe her as calm but resolute, guiding him through the storm while simultaneously managing her own emotional response. Meghan's presence underscored the reality that while the monarchy could sever titles and privileges, it could not sever personal bonds or the commitment between the couple. Her support provided Harry with the foundation to endure the moment, even as the weight of rejection pressed down. The public response amplified the emotional impact. Social media platforms were flooded with hashtags, trending topics, and commentary dissecting every angle. Some fans sent messages of support, gifts, and letters. Others criticized the monarchy, citing perceived injustice. News outlets ran continuous coverage, featuring interviews with experts, former staff members, and royal commentators. The immediacy of this global attention added pressure to Harry's already fragile emotional state. Imagine being in his position, grappling with personal devastation while knowing the world is watching every reaction. And yet, even amid the chaos, Harry was reportedly thinking strategically. He recognized that the collapse, while emotionally raw, had implications beyond the personal. Advisors encouraged him to process before acting, to document his experiences, and to consider how public statements might shape the long-term narrative. Harry, according to insiders, was deeply aware that his next steps would be scrutinized, dissected, and potentially weaponized. Every word mattered. Every choice carried weight. In the hours following the collapse, the ripple effects continued. Palace staff worked tirelessly to stabilize operations, ensuring that public engagements, security arrangements, and daily routines were maintained. Legal teams analyzed potential challenges, including security risks, public relations fallout, and contractual obligations. Meanwhile, private communications with family members began, though these conversations were reportedly tense, emotional, and at times contentious. Every interaction reflected the new reality. The monarchy had taken a dramatic step, and its consequences were immediate, far-reaching, and unpredictable. Yet, despite the intensity, there were subtle moments of humanity. Aides noted that Harry, even in his emotional state, displayed remarkable awareness of the broader context. He expressed concern for his family, the monarchy's reputation, and the well-being of those around him. He recognized that while he had been disowned, his actions and words would continue to influence public perception. In many ways, the collapse became a crucible, testing not only Harry's resilience, but also his capacity for measured response in the face of overwhelming emotional turmoil. And then, as the initial fallout settled into an uneasy rhythm, new information emerged that would escalate the drama even further. Leaked messages, confidential documents, and insider accounts began to surface, revealing the intricate web of decisions, conversations, and pressures that had culminated in the dissolution. These revelations painted a picture of a palace grappling not just with a single act, but with decades of tension, mistrust, and unresolved grievances, and they would profoundly shape public perception in ways no one could have anticipated. The collapse, therefore, was both an ending and a beginning. It marked the immediate emotional impact of dissolution, while simultaneously opening the door to a deeper exploration of hidden truths, secret dynamics, and shocking revelations that would emerge in the days, weeks, and months that followed. And as the world watched Harry navigate this unprecedented crisis, one question loomed larger than any other. What would come next? And could any reconciliation ever be possible? But the most explosive consequences of Harry's collapse, the hidden leaks, the secret alliances, and the personal betrayals that would rock the royal family, were still waiting to be revealed, lying just beyond the reach of public awareness, ready to transform a personal tragedy into a historic scandal. Have you ever witnessed a story so explosive that it consumes every news cycle, dominates social media, and sparks debate across the globe within minutes? That is exactly what happened after Prince Harry's dissolution. The palace announcement didn't just make headlines. It ignited a full-blown global media frenzy, turning one man's personal tragedy into an international spectacle. And in a world obsessed with instant reaction, the fallout was instantaneous, relentless, and unpredictable. Within moments of the official announcement, news outlets from London to New York, Tokyo to Sydney, were racing to break the story. Headlines screamed, broadcasts cut into scheduled programming, and live feeds captured analysts and commentators reacting in real time. Some framed the event as a scandal of unprecedented magnitude, while others highlighted the emotional dimensions of Harry's collapse. Across every platform, the story became impossible to ignore, a mix of tragedy, intrigue, and palace politics that captivated millions. Social media amplified the frenzy exponentially. Hashtags trended almost immediately, with supporters, critics, and curious observers weighing in. Memes, reaction videos, and viral posts flooded platforms. Twitter threads dissected every phrase of the palace statement. Instagram stories speculated about Harry's health and Meghan's response. TikTok videos analyzed possible motives behind the dissolution. In this hyper-connected world, nothing remained private, and every action, facial expression, or public appearance became fodder for global consumption. One striking feature of the media coverage was its polarization. On one side were those who viewed the dissolution as cruel, unfair, and disproportionate, a public rejection that disregarded decades of loyalty, service, and personal sacrifice. Supporters argued that Harry had been treated unjustly, emphasizing the pressures he endured growing up in the royal spotlight, the grief of losing his mother, and the relentless scrutiny he and Meghan faced. Memorable social media campaigns emerged almost immediately, encouraging solidarity with Harry and calls for public accountability. On the other side were commentators who framed the decision as a necessary assertion of authority. They emphasized tradition, protocol, and the need for the monarchy to maintain control in the face of public criticism. These narratives highlighted potential breaches of trust, leaks to the press, and the perceived challenges Harry posed to institutional stability. For them, the dissolution was not a personal betrayal, but a measured action to protect centuries of royal tradition. The result was a worldwide conversation characterized by intense emotion, divided opinion, and heated debate. Interestingly, the global media frenzy also revealed cultural differences in perception. In the United States, many outlets emphasized the human and emotional elements of Harry's collapse, portraying him as a relatable figure grappling with profound loss and betrayal. In Europe, coverage often focused on institutional implications, dissecting how the monarchy could survive and maintain authority while managing internal conflicts. In Asia and Australia, attention was drawn to both elements, the drama of the personal story and the intrigue of royal protocol. Across continents, the same event was interpreted through diverse lenses, each amplifying aspects of the story that resonated with local audiences. Experts were called in to provide analysis, further fueling public fascination. Royal commentators, psychologists, and media analysts dissected every angle, what the disownment meant for Harry's mental health, how it might affect his relationship with Meghan and his children, and what it implied about the future of the monarchy. Some offered empathetic perspectives, acknowledging the emotional toll of decades-long tension and public scrutiny. Others offered strategic analyses, highlighting potential pitfalls, public perception challenges, and long-term consequences. Every expert's commentary added layers to the narrative, reinforcing its complexity and keeping audiences glued to coverage. Meanwhile, investigative journalists began digging into the palace's inner workings, piecing together accounts from former staff, aides, and insiders. Leaks suggested secret meetings, private confrontations, and strategic communications that had been orchestrated in the weeks leading up to the disownment. Reporters uncovered what they described as document trails and confidential emails that painted a detailed, behind-the-scenes picture of how and why the decision was made. Each revelation fueled the frenzy, keeping viewers, readers, and followers on edge, waiting for the next bombshell to emerge. The emotional reactions of the public were equally intense. Supporters organized online vigils, digital petitions, and community discussions expressing sympathy and outrage. Some even attempted to contact palace representatives directly, sending letters, gifts, or social media messages of solidarity. Critics, meanwhile, used the platforms to reinforce narratives of discipline, tradition, and the necessity of upholding royal authority. The polarization created a feedback loop. Every statement, video, or post generated responses that intensified the discussion, ensuring the story remained in the global spotlight for days, weeks, and even months. One particularly striking aspect of the reaction was the viral spread of amateur analysis. Fans and independent commentators dissected footage of Harry's public appearances, body language, and facial expressions, attempting to read emotional cues and predict next moves. Every handshake, glance, or hesitation was analyzed as a signal of loyalty, tension, or potential reconciliation. This hyper-focus on minutiae amplified public engagement, creating an almost obsessive global following that transformed a personal event into a spectacle of universal fascination. In the midst of the frenzy, palace communications teams faced a monumental challenge. They needed to maintain the monarchy's image, manage media inquiries, and control the narrative while also respecting the human dimensions of the situation. Official statements emphasized procedure, tradition, and institutional necessity, but the language could not fully contain the emotional impact or public speculation. Every press release, official tweet, and spokesperson statement was scrutinized, dissected, and debated, ensuring that the story remained in the headlines long after the initial announcement. And yet, amid all this chaos, the human element remained central. People around the world connected with Harry's vulnerability, empathized with his struggle, and speculated about the private pain behind the headlines. Commentators highlighted the extraordinary stress of public life, the impact of media intrusion, and the challenge of navigating personal grief within the constraints of centuries-old tradition. This universal resonance kept the story relevant, making it not just a royal scandal, but a tale of human struggle and resilience that audiences could relate to, discuss, and share. But the frenzy also created unexpected complications. The constant attention intensified emotional strain on Harry, Meghan, and their close associates. Advisors reported sleepless nights, heightened anxiety, and the need for careful planning to navigate public appearances safely. Every interaction with media, every statement, and every gesture was now a potential headline. The relentless scrutiny magnified the psychological impact, forcing the couple to make strategic decisions under extreme pressure. As the global conversation raged, other royal family members were drawn into the vortex. Statements, interviews, and private communications from other family members began to leak, adding layers of tension, speculation, and intrigue. Was there hope for reconciliation? Were there ongoing private negotiations? Who within the family supported Harry, and who sided with the king? The uncertainty kept the public captivated, each new tidbit reinforcing the sense that the story was far from over. And then came the first hints of a new narrative twist. Some insiders began suggesting that Harry's disownment might trigger legal challenges, public campaigns, or even international diplomatic ramifications. Observers speculated on whether charities, partnerships, and foundations associated with Harry could be impacted. Could the monarchy enforce total exclusion, or would Harry find ways to navigate the restrictions imposed by the dissolution? Each question sparked further speculation, ensuring that curiosity remained high and audiences stayed engaged. The media frenzy also introduced a powerful element: the humanization of royal protocol. For the first time, viewers, readers, and followers were witnessing the emotional cost of decisions that were often portrayed as formal, strategic, and detached. Harry's collapse, the intimate details of his reaction, and Meghan's steadfast support highlighted the tension between institutional necessity and personal humanity. The story became not just about titles, privileges, and protocol, but about loyalty, love, and emotional resilience under extreme pressure. And even as the world absorbed the spectacle, the most shocking developments were yet to unfold. Hidden correspondences,